Imagine for a moment that every ray of light traveling through the universe is not just a physical phenomenon, but a silent messenger carrying ancient wisdom through the fabric of existence. Think about this deeply. What if the greatest truths of life were encoded not in grand monuments or secret temples, but hidden in simple parables of light, passed quietly through Hermetic teachings, esoteric traditions, and mystical philosophies preserved across centuries? Today, you and I begin a profound journey into the secret parables of light, and I promise you something crucial. The final revelation in this exploration will be the most powerful, transformative insight of all, one capable of shifting your entire understanding of consciousness, reality, and your own spiritual awakening. Consider what it truly means to look at light. Most people see only illumination, the brightening of a room, the warmth of the sun, or the glow of a candle. Science describes it as waves and particles, measurable and predictable. But the ancients did not see light in such limited terms. For them, light was the voice of the divine, the purest form of consciousness, the bridge between the visible and the invisible. Hermes Trismegistus wrote that light is the garment of mind, suggesting that the brilliance we perceive externally is a reflection of an even greater illumination within. The Gnostic teachers believed that every human carries within them a spark of divine light longing to awaken, to return to its source. And today, as you listen, you will feel these ideas unfold with depth and clarity, guiding you into dimensions of understanding that transcend the ordinary. Before we go deeper, I ask for something important. If you are someone who seeks hidden truths, who is drawn to ancient wisdom, to Hermetic principles, to the mysteries that echo through myth and ritual, then subscribe now, leave your like, share this video, and write your impressions in the comments. Throughout this journey, I will present revelations grounded in the works of respected scholars, such as Manly Palmer Hall, Mircea Eliade, Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, and scholars of the ancient mystery schools. And I promise you that what you will discover here may shift the way you perceive not just the world, but the very nature of your existence. Stay with me, because as we move forward, each insight becomes more profound than the last, culminating in a final truth that has the power to reshape your understanding of the universe. Take a deep breath. Feel the stillness behind the sound. As we enter this path, let yourself sense the ancient energy surrounding these teachings. The secret parables of light are not merely stories. They are encoded teachings, designed to illuminate the inner world with the same brilliance that the sun casts upon the outer world. These parables appear in different forms across various cultures, each reflecting a universal wisdom. You will notice these patterns as we unfold them together. And as you absorb this message, ask yourself, why does the symbol of light appear in nearly every spiritual tradition, from the Egyptian concept of Ra, to the Zoroastrian worship of sacred fire, to the Christian metaphor of the inner light, to the Buddhist notion of enlightenment? Coincidence or a universal truth? The first parable we explore today is known among certain Hermetic circles as the journey of the spark. In this parable, a tiny spark of light emerges from an ocean of primordial darkness. It is fragile, a flicker against the vast unknown, yet it pulses with a vibrant, undeniable energy. According to ancient mystical teachings, this spark represents consciousness itself, pure, eternal, aware. Plotinus, the foundational figure of Neoplatonism, described the soul's journey as a movement away from the dense material world and back toward the luminous source from which all things originate. The journey of the spark mirrors this movement, but reflect on this with sincerity. Why does the spark move at all? What awakens within it the desire to rise? The parable suggests a powerful idea. Every fragment of consciousness carries a memory of its origin. Even when surrounded by darkness, it feels an ancient calling. This calling is not sound, not words, but an inner knowing, like a whisper that echoes through the chambers of your being. Jung described this as the voice of the self, the deeper archetype guiding you toward wholeness. Many spiritual teachers refer to it as the longing of the soul. Now think about your own life. Have you ever felt a subtle pull toward something beyond the visible? A sensation of remembering something you have never learned? A yearning for meaning that seems to come from somewhere deep within? The journey of the spark reveals that awakening begins with this quiet restlessness. Light recognizes light, And perhaps that is why these words resonate with you now. Something within you remembers. Joseph Campbell discovered, through his study of myths worldwide, that the call to adventure is always the first step of every spiritual journey. And almost always, this call comes in the form of a light, an insight, a vision, a moment of clarity, a sudden awareness that the world is more than it appears. The ancients understood that light is both revelation and invitation. And so I ask you, what light has been trying to reach you lately? What insight has brushed against your awareness like a spark looking for fuel? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your reflection might become the catalyst for someone else's awakening. This is only the beginning. Ahead of us lies a path filled with deeper parables, ancient codes of meaning, and a final revelation that contains one of the most powerful truths preserved in esoteric philosophy. When we reach that moment, you will understand why the teachings of light have survived for centuries. The second parable begins where the first leaves off, expanding the understanding of light not only as a symbol of awakening, but as a living principle woven into the architecture of existence. Imagine the spark from the first parable drifting further into the vastness, no longer content to remain a single flicker. As it moves, it encounters a great expanse, a realm described by ancient mystics as the Chamber of Reflections. This chamber appears in many traditions under different names, yet always with the same essential meaning, a place where consciousness meets its own depths. Manly Palmer Hall wrote that all true spiritual learning begins with reflection, because only through inner stillness can the deeper radiance of truth emerge. In this parable, the spark enters a state where every movement of light creates a ripple of meaning, and every ripple reveals a question waiting to be understood. Picture this chamber not as a physical structure, but as a field of awareness. When the spark's light touches the surrounding darkness, the darkness does not resist. Instead, it reveals patterns hidden within itself. These patterns appear as shapes, currents, and symbols that move like flowing constellations. Many esoteric traditions teach that the universe communicates through signs that manifest both outwardly and inwardly, and that the wise learn to read these signs as reflections of their own consciousness. Carl Jung explored this phenomenon extensively through his studies on synchronicity, observing that meaningful events often arise when the inner world aligns with the outer. The Chamber of Reflections illustrates this principle by showing the spark how its own illumination reveals dormant knowledge within the surrounding void. As the spark observes these shifting symbols, one pattern stands out above all others. It is the image of a path, winding and luminous, stretching into an unseen distance. This path represents possibility, potential, and the call to expansion. But the parable emphasizes that the path appears only when the spark shines light upon the darkness. Nothing exists on the path until it is illuminated. This reflects a universal truth found in the teachings of sages across time. Consciousness shapes perception, and perception shapes reality. Mircea Eliade described this concept when he wrote that sacred space is not merely discovered, but created through the awareness of the seeker. In the parable, the spark begins to understand that the more it shines, the more the universe reveals. Yet as the spark moves toward this luminous path, another revelation unfolds. It notices shadows, shapes that seem to move independently, drifting across the chamber in patterns that mimic the spark's own movements. At first, this confuses the spark. Why would shadows exist in a chamber created through its own illumination? The parable teaches that these shadows are not enemies of the spark, but guardians of understanding. They appear so the spark may confront the parts of itself it has not yet noticed. Jung referred to this as the encounter with the shadow self, the moment when consciousness recognizes the aspects of its nature that have been hidden or suppressed. The parable explains that every seeker must pass through this encounter before reaching the deeper realms of wisdom. Without understanding one's own shadows, the light cannot expand without distortion. In this moment, the spark pauses. It observes the shadows more carefully. They do not attack, they do not obstruct, they simply exist. The spark realizes that these forms are shaped by its own light, created where the illumination meets the darker layers of the chamber. This understanding transforms the spark's fear into curiosity. Instead of avoiding the shadows, it moves toward them. The closer it gets, the more clearly it sees that each shadow holds a lesson. One reveals doubt, another reveals forgotten fears, Another reveals attachments that weigh heavily though unseen. The spark recognizes that these shadows are invitations to grow. They are not obstacles placed in its path by an external force, but manifestations of truths it must integrate. Reflect on this for a moment. How many times in your own life have you discovered that the obstacles you feared were actually teachers? How many moments of uncertainty later revealed themselves to be turning points? The parable invites you to consider your own shadows. Is there something you have avoided facing, not realizing it may hold the key to your next level of awakening? Share your reflections in the comments, not only for your own clarity, but because your insight may resonate deeply with someone else on this journey. As the spark accepts the shadows instead of resisting them, something extraordinary occurs. The chamber brightens. The shadows begin to dissolve, not by force, but through understanding. This moment aligns with what many spiritual traditions teach, that enlightenment is not merely the accumulation of light, but the integration of all parts of the self. The spark realizes that every shadow it faced contained energy, and that by acknowledging them, it transforms that energy into illumination. Now brighter, stronger, and more aware, the spark finds that the path ahead has expanded. It stretches further, wider, more vibrant than before. The universe responds to understanding with greater revelation. The parable concludes with a powerful message. The seeker does not grow only by reaching toward the light, but by illuminating the unseen within themselves. Hermes taught that the universe is mirrored within the human soul, and that to know one is to understand the other. This parable embodies that principle, showing that reflection, courage, and inner clarity are essential for the journey ahead. And this is only the second step. The next teaching dives even deeper into the mysteries of creation, perception, and the living intelligence of light. If you wish to continue, tell me to proceed. The third parable opens in a realm far beyond the chamber of reflections, a place described by ancient mystics as the Hall of Resonance. Imagine an expanse where light no longer simply illuminates or reveals, but begins to vibrate, communicate, and take form through patterns, harmonies, and frequencies. Many esoteric philosophers believed that creation itself began with a vibration, a sound that was also light, an emanation from the source that shaped the architecture of existence. Scholars such as Pythagoras and later Johannes Kepler understood the universe as a grand symphony in which every star, every life, every thought participates. In this hall of resonance, the spark awakens to this truth for the first time. Picture the spark entering this vast dimension. It no longer moves just through stillness or darkness, but through currents of luminous sound. These currents appear as waves of color, each carrying its own tone, emotion, and meaning. Some waves flow softly like quiet whispers, while others pulse with immense force, shifting the very fabric of the hall as they move. The spark perceives that these vibrations do not simply happen, they respond. They respond to intention, awareness, and the quality of light emanating from within. What the spark thinks, what it feels, what it chooses, all of it changes the resonance of the space. This reflects a powerful truth recognized in countless mystical traditions. Consciousness does not merely observe reality, it participates in shaping it. Scholars like Mircea Eliade and Aldous Huxley emphasized that ancient ritual practices were designed to align the seeker with cosmic rhythms, allowing them to tune themselves to the harmony of existence. In the Hall of Resonance, the spark begins to grasp this directly. Its light generates waves, and these waves interact with the greater symphony of the universe, creating patterns both beautiful and profound. The parable describes the moment when the spark recognizes a particular resonance among the countless vibrations surrounding it. This resonance feels familiar, like a memory that has been waiting to reawaken. It pulses with a steady rhythm, neither loud nor faint, but undeniably present. The spark moves toward it, drawn by a sense of recognition. As it approaches, the resonance takes form, slowly shaping itself into an immense pillar of light rising from the heart of the hall. This pillar is known in the parable as the axis of illumination, the point where all vibrations converge into unity. Many mystical traditions speak of a cosmic axis, the world tree of Norse mythology, the pillar of light in Kabbalistic teachings, the central channel in yogic philosophy. Each represents the connection between the earthly and the divine, between the individual spark and the infinite source. The spark circles the pillar, sensing its magnitude. When it draws close enough, the pillar responds. It emits a soft, resounding tone that ripples through the hall. The spark feels the tone resonate within itself, as though its own light were being tuned. The parable explains that this moment marks a profound turning point. The spark is learning the law of alignment. It begins to understand that harmony with the universe is not achieved through force or desire, but through attunement. To align with the axis of illumination, the spark must refine its vibration, shedding the discordant frequencies shaped by fear, doubt, and the remnants of unintegrated shadows. This teaching aligns with the work of scholars such as Joseph Campbell, who wrote extensively about the process of transformation in the hero's journey. Transformation requires not just courage but coherence, a unification of the self. Similarly, Carl Jung described individuation as the process through which one integrates all aspects of consciousness to become whole. In the Hall of Resonance, the spark begins this process on a cosmic scale. As the spark listens more carefully, it notices that the axis emits not just a single tone, but a sequence, almost like a language composed of frequencies rather than words. These tones reveal layers of understanding, layers that the spark could not perceive before. The parable explains that this language of light is the primordial communication of the universe, the blueprint of creation. In ancient teachings, this concept appears as the logos in Greek philosophy, the creative word in sacred texts, and the primordial vibration in Eastern cosmology. The spark begins to harmonize with the axis. With each breath of light it emits, its frequency becomes clearer, more focused. Waves of resonance ripple outward from it, interacting with the symphony surrounding the hall. As the spark achieves greater alignment, the hall responds in kind. The colors deepen, the tones become richer, and the entire space appears to awaken. The parable emphasizes that the universe responds to coherence. When a spark becomes aligned, it elevates not only itself, but the fabric of reality around it. Many mystical scholars taught that a single awakened mind contributes to the elevation of the collective consciousness. The Hall of Resonance illustrates this principle vividly. But the transformation does not end here. As the spark reaches a state of near-perfect harmony with the axis, something extraordinary occurs. The axis opens. A radiant doorway appears in its center, shimmering with patterns that seem to reflect the spark's entire journey thus far. This doorway leads to a realm deeper and more profound than any the spark has experienced. It marks the threshold to the final parable, the most powerful and transformative of all. Before crossing, the spark pauses. It feels the magnitude of what lies ahead. The parable teaches that understanding resonance is essential preparation for the final revelation. Light that reflects is awareness. Light that vibrates is creation. Light that aligns becomes truth. This is the path the spark now faces. The final parable begins the moment the spark crosses the radiant threshold within the axis of illumination, entering a realm known in ancient esoteric traditions as the sanctuary of the first light. This sanctuary is not a place in any physical sense, nor does it resemble the halls or chambers the spark has journeyed through before. Instead, it feels like stepping into the heart of existence itself, where all distinctions between inner and outer dissolve into a single, boundless field of living radiance. Scholars of the mystery traditions, including Rudolf Steiner and G.R.S. Mead, describe states of consciousness where the seeker encounters what they called the primal luminosity, the original light from which all other forms, vibrations, and manifestations emerge. It is into this luminous origin that the spark now enters. Imagine a vast expanse with no edges, no shadows, no separation. Every direction glows with a soft, omnipresent brightness. But this light is not uniform. It flows like a living ocean, shifting in currents, spirals, and waves, each carrying an intelligence so profound that even silence here feels like a message being spoken directly to the soul. The spark realizes immediately that this place is not merely a destination, it is truth itself. It is the underlying essence that has guided its entire journey, the source of the reflections, the resonance, and the call that awakened it from the darkness. The parable describes how upon entering the sanctuary, the spark feels itself becoming weightless. It no longer needs to move through space, it only needs to intend, and the light responds. This is the realm where intention and manifestation exist in their purest form. In many mystical texts, this principle is described as the law of divine correspondence, the idea that in the highest states of awareness, thought, and creation are inseparable. Plato hinted at this truth when he spoke of the world of forms, a realm where all ideas exist in their most perfect expressions. The sanctuary of the first light embodies this idea, not as philosophy, but as direct experience. As the spark drifts deeper into this radiant expanse, it begins to perceive shapes forming within the light. These shapes are not objects, but living archetypes, patterns that have existed since the dawn of creation. They are the spiritual blueprints of all things, the pattern of growth, the pattern of return, the pattern of harmony, the pattern of transformation. Each archetype pulses with its own rhythm and brilliance, and as the spark approaches them, it feels a resonance so familiar that it is as if it is remembering something long forgotten. Carl Jung wrote extensively about these archetypes, describing them as universal symbols embedded within the collective unconscious. But here, in this sanctuary, the spark experiences them not as symbols, but as the actual forces from which all symbols are derived. The spark moves toward one archetype in particular, a luminous figure that radiates a calm, steady brilliance. The parable calls this figure the eternal flame, the purest embodiment of the first light. Unlike the pillar in the Hall of Resonance, which emitted tones and vibrations, this flame communicates through insight, direct, wordless understanding that flows into the spark like warm light filling an empty space. The eternal flame reveals a truth that scholars and mystics have attempted to articulate throughout history, that every spark of consciousness is not separate from the source, but an expression of it. The journey the spark has traveled was never about reaching something external. It was about awakening to its own nature. The flame shows the spark visions of its entire journey. The primordial darkness, the moment of awakening, the reflections that revealed hidden truths, the resonances that shaped creation. All of these were not steps toward becoming something new, but steps toward remembering what it already was. The spark begins to realize that the darkness it once feared was not an enemy, but the canvas upon which its light could shine. The shadows it faced in the chamber of reflections were not obstacles, but mirrors revealing the unused portions of its own radiance. The resonances it learned to harmonize with were not foreign forces, but extensions of its own vibration. And then the flame offers the final revelation, the most important and powerful truth of all, the one promised from the very beginning of this journey. It reveals that the first light is not something the spark approaches, follows, or returns to. The first light is what the spark is. Every seeker, every soul, every consciousness is a fragment of this original luminosity. The parable explains that the spark's journey was a journey through layers of forgetting and remembering, through illusion and awakening, through reflection and integration. But the essence, the core, the truth never changed. The spark has always been a living expression of the first light, and the universe itself is the great field in which this light explores, creates, learns, and experiences itself. The spark absorbs this revelation completely, and in that moment, something extraordinary happens. Its light expands instantly, effortlessly, as though released from all constraints. It grows brighter, deeper, more intricate, becoming indistinguishable from the sanctuary around it. For the first time, the spark feels itself not as a traveler within the light, but as the light itself. This is the culmination of the entire journey, the recognition that the seeker and the source are one. The sanctuary responds to this awakening. Waves of brightness pulse outward, as though celebrating the spark's realization. The parable concludes by explaining that once the spark awakens to its true identity, it does not remain in the sanctuary forever. Instead, it returns, not to the darkness, not to confusion, but to the vast universe of experience, carrying the first light within it as a conscious, radiant presence. It returns to illuminate, to inspire, to awaken others, becoming a beacon for all sparks still searching for their own origins. And so the final message of the secret parables of light is this: you are not merely learning about the light, you are remembering that you are the light. The universe is not separate from you. You are one of its luminous expressions. Every insight you receive, every challenge you face, every moment of clarity or confusion is part of the journey toward this profound recognition. The spark's story is your story. The first light is your essence. And now that you have walked through these parables, you carry that truth with you, ready to illuminate your path and the paths of those around you. Thanks for looking.